Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Xils-Lab Xils 4 tutorial series. I'm going to take a deeper look at the additional modules today. We've already had a look at the supplemental envelopes, envelopes 1 and 2, but today we'll have a look at LFO, sample and hold, and the voltage processor. If you're enjoying this series and you want to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. Fantastic way to do that. LFO first, low frequency oscillator. We've already had an introduction to the concept of LFOs when we had a look at the oscillators. It's simply an oscillator that cycles very slowly. There's nothing magic about it. Now, even though oscillator 3 is perfectly suited to act as an LFO, in fact, that's why it's got its own section in the advanced matrix, we do have an additional LFO just for that extra flexibility as well. Now, what I've got here is the simplest possible setup. I've got a single sine wave. I've got frequency control with my keyboard. Other than that, it's going directly to the output. Simple as you like. Now I'm going to connect the LFO module to modulate the pitch of that oscillator. So let's go into the advanced matrix. Here's the LFO input. Connect that to oscillator 1 frequency. And now when I press a note, you can hear a sine wave low frequency oscillator acting on the pitch of oscillator 1. It's a sine wave because that's the current type. Now it says type X3, this is for Xils 3. There are separate LFO algorithms for X3 and X4, but the only one that actually is any different as far as I can tell is the triangle. X3 is a lower LFO than X4. Other than that, they seem to be identical to me. If anyone knows otherwise, put it in the comments below and I'll pin it. Let's get back to our sine wave. Rate is how quickly the LFO cycles. Sync, pretty obvious. Whether or not it's synced to the host tempo, just close my matrix down so that we can see. If I turn sync on, now we're at tempo divided by 6. As opposed to fixed hertz. So let's get it cycling at 1 hertz. So that's every second this LFO is applying this sine wave shape to the pitch of oscillator 1, making it go up and down. Let's jump over to level next. This is the amount by which that modulation is applied. So if I pull level right the way down, you're not going to hear any modulation at all. There's our static sine wave. And as I begin to increase the level, it slowly begins to bring that modulation in. So level is very often called depth. It's basically the amount or the depth by which this modulation is being allowed to affect the modulation destination. In this case, the destination is the pitch, the frequency of oscillator 1. So if I increase the level and get some really wild modulations. Now the reason I jumped over width is because at the moment it doesn't do anything. This is pulse width. And obviously pulse width is only going to work when we're dealing with pulse waves. So let's dial in a pulse wave, which is this symbol here. And now if I bring the width right down, you can hear it's high for the vast majority of the time and low for a very small amount of time. And the opposite way around, this is going to be mostly low. Tiny little blips up to the high frequency. Down at the bottom of the module, we have delay and fade knobs. Now, as things stand, they're not going to do anything. Ordinarily, this is going to be an amount of time that the synthesizer will wait before beginning to apply the LFO to an incoming signal. I'm going to give you a demonstration of why this isn't doing anything while you try to imagine why it might not be doing anything. So if I crank delay and fade all the way up and hit a key, that LFO happened immediately. The reason there's no delay, the reason those knobs aren't doing anything, is because the LFO needs an instruction as to when that key's been pressed. By default, the LFO has absolutely no idea that a key has been pressed on the keyboard. We need to connect the keyboard to the low frequency oscillator in order for it to be able to trigger this delay command. If we have a look down in the keyboard matrix, we have an output to the LFO reset. This doesn't stand for write, it stands for reset. So let's send our gate signal, which is the thing that happens when we press a keyboard. And we'll connect that to the LFO reset command. And now the delay control will do something. Let's make it nice and big. So I'm going to press a key. No modulation. And if we wait, I've set it too long, I have a nice 7 seconds, talk over the top of it. There we go. Now I'll pull the delay down to a little bit more sensible. And now I'll bring in a nice long fade. What that means is that the modulation isn't going to jump in all instantly. It'll be gradually introduced. You can hear those modulations getting deeper and deeper. If I bring the level up a little bit more, it'll be even more obvious. Hear the pitch getting higher and higher and higher as the LFO is introduced gradually. Other than that, LFOs are pretty straightforward, so we're pretty much done with that module. Let's disconnect it and move on to the sample and hold. Okay, this is the best way I think to visualize what a sample and hold module does. It's a modulator. It's going to output a control voltage at the end of the day. That's the most important thing. It's just another module that's going to output some sort of control voltage. It's going to go to another module somewhere else in the system. It's the input for the sample and hold that's all important. Because what happens is that every set amount of time, every period of time, as specified by our rate knob, the sample and hold is going to take a snapshot. Imagine like taking a photograph of an incoming signal, and then for the remaining period of time until it takes its next snapshot, it's going to output exactly and only that control voltage. So it takes this instantaneous snapshot picture and then outputs a static value until the next cycle rolls around and it takes a new snapshot. Let's get a demonstration up and running and you'll understand pretty quickly what's going on. Now, sample and hold has to be configured by the additional inputs. So we're going to go to this section down at the bottom. It's a modulator, and here is our sample and hold module. And we're going to connect that, surprise, surprise, to oscillator 1 frequency. Now here's the secret sauce for the sample and hold module. If you don't provide an input to it, and we haven't provided an input to it, we've taken an output from it, but we've not given it an input. By default, the sample and hold has its own internal white noise generator. In other words, the snapshots that it's going to take are going to be completely random signals. As we've discussed previously in this tutorial series, white noise is a constantly variant control voltage. There's no pattern or detail to it at all. So if we take a snapshot of white noise, it could be anything. It could be any control voltage from the maximum to the minimum that this synthesizer can understand. So now every second, the pitch of this C that I'm going to play is not going to be C. It's going to be varied both positively and negatively. Here we go. So the native pitch of the note that I played is 523 Hertz, and you can see notes both above and below that. The amount that they're above and below is once again specified by the level knob. This is the depth or amount of the modulation that this module is being allowed to apply to the thing that it's connected to its destination. Well, at the moment, its destination is oscillator 1 frequency. So if I increase the level, the variance, the total range of pitches is now going to get bigger. And at very small levels, got very minor pitch corrections. You can see we're just wandering around the note C there. Let's dial more of it in and speed it up. And this is a very common way of getting computer chatter. It's one of the essential kind of components of something like the R2D2 sound that uses many other kinds of techniques as well, but sample and hold is an essential characteristic of that kind of randomness. The central switch has 3 modes. When it's set to off, it basically means that it's not connected to the outside world. It's free spinning, it's doing its own thing, and it's doing it in hertz, in periods of cycles per second. If I set it to sync, it's now locked to the host of our DAW, so now you can see tempo times 2, but it's still free spinning. If I press a key, you can hear when I press the key there, it almost immediately jumped to the next snapshot. But every time I press a key, let's make the rate a bit slower. You can tell that every time I press one of those keys, we're waiting a different amount of time before the sample and hold in the background kind of does its thing. But we actually have an internal reset command here. So now every time I press the key, you're going to wait exactly the same amount of time before the next snapshot. So it's absolutely consistent. Now everything that we've done up until now has used the internal noise generator, but you can take an external signal to your sample and hold module as well. Now what I'm going to do is tie oscillator 3's pulse wave into the sample and hold input. So now instead of it taking a snapshot of noise, which can be any value, pulse waves only ever generate 2 different control voltages, the high one and the low one. So now we're going to get a completely different response. The sample and hold module only has 2 possible values that it can read, either high or low, coming from oscillator 3's output. So here we go. So what it's reading there is essentially random ups and downs. Oscillator 3 is cycling very quickly. It's operating at audio rates here, much, much faster than the snapshots that the sample and hold module is taking. So it's essentially random as to whether or not it's going to take a snapshot of a high signal or a low signal. It's not changing every time. It could be either, depending on what's happening with the input, the oscillator 3's input at the time. So you're going to hear different lengths of times of these control voltages. There you go. Because sometimes multiple highs will be connected together to make one longer output. It's just to show that sample and hold is a really interesting module for both inputs and outputs. Really cool way to generate kind of pseudo-random signals. Now onto the voltage processor. This one's a bit tricky, but it can be done. I promise you we'll understand it by the end of today. And I'm going to show you a really, really famous and popular use case for how to use voltage processors as well. The first thing that we need to do is get our matrices nice and clear. I'm going to throw all of this other stuff away. And I'm going to get us to the situation where keyboard 1 is operating an oscillator, sine wave oscillator, straight to the output with absolutely nothing else going on. Now I'm going to connect the voltage processor into that signal chain. I'm going to open my advanced matrix and I'm going to disconnect my keyboard modulation. So now when I press that same 5-note arpeggio, you're just going to hear the same note all the time because there's no longer any keyboard-based control voltage being sent to the input of oscillator 1's frequency. Look at the keys in the virtual keyboard. Playing exactly the same arpeggio, you're just hearing the same note all of the time. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to send the keyboard's control voltage, instead of sending it straight into the oscillator 1 frequency modulation input, I'm going to send it into the voltage processor input, connect those two together, and then out of the voltage processor to the oscillator 1 frequency. Now here's our voltage processor. At the moment all of the knobs are turned down. In other words, it's not going to have any impact. This is a control voltage generator, just like the sample and hold and the LFO, and all of these other modules that we're looking at. They're modules that are capable of sending a voltage, an instruction command to some other part of the system to have an impact on that destination. Well, at the moment, the voltage processor is going to have no impact on the system. And so here's our arpeggio, exactly as it was previously. Now I'm going to increase the level of the voltage processor to maximum. So what that means is that any control voltage input it receives, it's going to pass straight on to the outside world. It's effectively a straight tube through which this control voltage signal is passing. Its output destination is oscillator 1 frequency, and so we're going to hear that change of pitch again. Pretty pointless so far. The voltage processor isn't bringing anything new to the party. But here's the magic about voltage processors. They're shock absorbers. That information that it receives from the outside world, its input, is a control voltage. When I press a key on the keyboard, that's outputting a control voltage of a particular amount. Doesn't matter what the number is, it's just a signal. The voltage processor receives that signal, and it has an internal memory, its last understanding, its last knowledge of the outside world. What was the last value it was given? Let's say that value was 1. And now it receives a signal from the outside world saying switch to 1.2. With the controls currently set as they are, it will send that 1.2 on to the next module and not care anything about it. But the moment I increase the attack knob, it's not going to feed that new signal to the outside world immediately. It's going to feed 1.01, 1.02, 1.03 over a period of time specified by this attack knob, 1 second. It's going to slowly introduce that control voltage to the outside world. So the last note I pressed was C. There's our C. Now I'm going to press a D 2 semitones above it. Eventually, the control voltage reaches its maximum amount. There's the extra control voltage that key has output, but it's been slowly drip fed into the system. It hasn't all happened instantly. Now the voltage processor has a new number in its internal memory. It's whatever control voltage me pressing that D on the keyboard output. Whatever that number is, that's what the voltage processor now knows. Every single time I press the note D from this point onwards, you hear exactly that note. Because the voltage processor is receiving a signal that's identical to its internal memory. There's no shock absorbing to be done. It just passes that value straight onto the outside world. And you hear the D. The moment I press E, that's a new control voltage higher than the previous one. Once again, that amended, that new value is slowly fed to the outside world, and we hear that new value ultimately manifested as an E, and here now you're hearing all of those E's. But attack only works for increases of control voltage. If I come back down, we're going to jump down instantaneously. So I'm going to go all the way back down to the C where I started, and you'll hear that C play instantly. So all notes going up will be slowly drip fed. Finally get up to D and then up to E. But all notes coming down will be instant. I played the C down at 260 Hz. Let's play a C an octave higher. We go all the way from that low value up to the new value and finally settle out there. Let's turn attack down. Have a guess what release does. This is the shock absorber for descending control voltages. So the last note I played was C. Let's play an A 3 semitones lower. Let's jump back up to C. Because I turned attack down, we're now getting up immediately. There's no shock absorbing for the increases of control voltage, only for decreases. Now, of course, we can travel in both directions. And this is where that famous use case that I described earlier comes. Because if I set the attack and release of the voltage processor to about 11 o'clock, we've got portamento. That's what portamento is. There's an internally wired voltage processor connected from the keyboard to the oscillator's frequency inputs specifically for this purpose. When you engage portamento and you mess with these controls, you're doing exactly what the voltage processor does. It's just that the voltage processor is capable of being applied to any other module in the system. You could apply it to the filter frequency, for instance, to apply the same kind of slewed shock absorb effect to an increase in frequency cutoff. Finally, of course, we have a delay. This is exactly what you would expect it to be, a period of time that you'll wait before introducing any of that new control voltage. I'll get my C centered, give myself a long delay, and play a low C. So you heard that C hold static for a while and then jump down to the lower note. So that's the voltage processor sorted, and that's all for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.